All right, good. All right, so lecture 4, part 1. This is the sort of, I consider it the fun part, because this is not just the theory. This is just what are you gonna do with it once you're inside the classroom. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is give you a general introduction to sort of pragmatics and SLA. You know, what's happened in second language acquisition when it comes to pragmatics. And then we're going to look specifically at speech acts and what's been done with speech acts in the classroom. And then we're going to look at the cooperative principle and what's been done with the cooperative principle. There's been a lot of work in speech acts and not a lot of work in the cooperative principle. And we'll talk about why that is. I hope you'll be able to see why that is as we go in. Okay. So let's start with pragmatics and SLA. So we're going to start with the definition from George Yule. Pragmatics is the study of contextualized speaker meaning. How more gets communicated than is actually said, right? So it's the part of linguistics that's based on what you and I understand about each other and the real world, successfully covering the distance between us, physical, social, and contextual. Think about what Sal and I were talking about last week when I said at one point, you would depend on whether you use a or the, depending upon what I think you know, right? So I gave you an example of going geographical directions. And I said, if I think you know what I'm talking about, I will say you'll go under the bridge because I think you'll remember it. But if I think you don't know, then it's a bridge. So my syntax is controlled by covering the distance between us, okay? Now, because that's what pragmatics controls, this, of course, is a very interesting issue for cross-cultural communication, right? Because what happens is once you're in one speech community, so you have a primary speech community. Now, that might be a multilingual speech community or a monolingual speech community, but it's your speech community, right? If you're a Hindu speaker living in India, the chances are you speak Hindu for some things, English for some things, and maybe a native dialect for other things. But that's your code of communication within your group. If you're a standard Midwestern American, or in fact British person, you basically speak English. So your code of communication has register variations within one language, okay? So because the distance between us, socially, physically, and contextually in one speech community has to be covered so regularly, like every minute of every day, we have conventions of behavior in which we communicate those things, right? So if I want to communicate that I am confused, I might say, oh, and that means confused. That isn't necessarily what they would say in another speech community. If I want to communicate that I'm sorry, there may be ways that I do that in my speech community that are conventionalized, right? We all understand in that speech community what we're all doing. So the issue becomes what happens when you go outside of that group. So Green's conduit metaphor, a conduit is if you can think of it as a tube that goes from one thing to another thing, and everything gets, how many of you use the bank, the automatic bank, where the tube goes up in the, it goes from you to the teller? So that's what we think of as a conduit. That's a typical conduit. And what we think when we communicate with each other typically is that what's in my head goes into your head, right? So if you think about it in terms of there's a triangle in my head, I explain that triangle to you, and in my mind, there's now a triangle in your head, right? But usually that's not the case. In fact, if there's a triangle in my head, maybe, hopefully, when I communicate to you, there's a shape in your head, but who knows if it's going to be a triangle. It might be more of a rhombus or something, because generally speaking, what we end up between each other is what we call a roughly mutual understanding, okay? But it's never normally like a conduit. It's not normally like that idea of whatever's in my head comes straight out of my head through language and goes straight into your head in the way I envisage it, right? Usually there's some difference. Now, what that difference is depends on our experience, contextually, physically, and socially with language, okay? The chances of that distance being covered successfully, it's more likely to be successful if we're from the same speech community, because we would do that thing in the same way. My triangle would look more like your triangle, okay? Whereas if we are from two different speech communities, particularly if we're from two different languages, my triangle and your triangle will probably look a whole lot different. So I'm not sure what it was that you understood from that. Hence, we have these pragmatic misunderstandings. So the field of second language acquisition came to this idea kind of late in the day. It was really in the 80s and 90s rather than the 60s and 70s. Partly because in the 60s and 70s, there was an overwhelming focus in second language acquisition on morphosyntax, okay? So what do I mean by that? I mean that researchers were interested in how grammar, syntax developed in a second language learner, how they worked out sentence structure, morphology structure. They weren't particularly interested in what we might think of as communicative competence, right? So how is it that we communicate? So we came to it fairly late, but when we did, this is Gabrielle Casper, who's still up and running at University of Hawaii. And they really started this by developing the term interlanguage pragmatic. So they said, just like syntax, morphology, phonology, you develop an interlanguage. Are we comfortable with the term interlanguage? What do we think that means?
Kind of intermediate stage between two languages.
Yes, it's what the definition is really a transitional grammar. So at any given point, if you have a language learner who's going from one language to another, the idea of interlanguage is if you sliced their brain, charmingly, at that point, you would see a certain system inside there. And some of those systems would be correct, and some of them would be incorrect. So an example might be if you sliced open an intermediate learner, and you said, let me look at their phonology development. You might find that a lot of things were correct at that particular time in their system, but incorrect is they can't do the difference between a long E and a short I. Okay, so instead of saying sheet, they're saying the other thing, shit. So that would be a problem in their interlanguage. Then also systematically, they maybe can't use the TH. Instead of saying th, they say f or dr or something else, okay? So at that point in time, that cross-section in time, their transitional grammar by that we mean general grammar, phonology, morphology, pragmatic, syntax, has these specific characteristics, okay? So what these people found when they started looking at pragmatics was the exact same thing, okay? That if you sliced open a learner's pragmatic structure at a certain point in time, there were certain stable things that they could do and certain things that they couldn't do, okay? That's literally exactly what that means. Now, there was an overwhelming focus initially on speech acts, particularly on morphosyntax. Two reasons, really. One is speech acts, frankly, are nice and easy, right? So you can say, can this learner apologize? Okay, so you can test them fairly easily if they can apologize successfully or not, right? The other thing is, in that time, morphosyntax was considered to be the real area of development. People were not so interested in phonology, semantics, pragmatics. So they just sort of pushed themselves towards what was critical at the time. And then the other thing that they did that's super important is divide the idea of pragmatics into language pragmatics into pragmalinguistic knowledge and socio-pragmatic knowledge. And you will see this distinction throughout everything that we look at in terms of SLA and EFL. Pragmalinguistic knowledge means understanding the actual words that you use. So can I say, can I, could I, what's the specific language that I'm using to make this request, and is it appropriate? So here's an example. This is a development of requests in a learner, and this is a description of pragmalinguistic development. It starts off of requests. So this is what a beginner learner starts off with, me no blue, meaning I need a blue pen, right? That's how they say the request. Give me, can I have an eraser? You got an eraser? I want an eraser. Have you got glue? Can I take a book? Can I borrow your pen? So you can see the development. That's called pragmalinguistic development. Slowly over time, the use of the linguistics forms gets more and more complicated, okay? Although in this case, there's still no final development of could, for example. You can see that they've got other pragmalinguistic strategies, but they're still not able to use, or they're still not volunteering the use of could, right? So that's pragmalinguistics. Socio-pragmatic is doing the right thing at the right time. Do you know when to use a request, right? Do you know at what point you should be using a request or an apology or some other speech act, okay? So to give you an example, we talked, I think, briefly about this last week. There's some work on speech acts and Hebrew and English, and what they found was that Hebrew learners of English would not apologize in the same places that Americans did. So Americans, if you came late for work, for example, everybody's in a work meeting and you're not there, you rush in and you say, oh, I'm sorry, and you sit down, and then afterwards you go up to your boss and you say, I'm really sorry, my tire blew on the highway, and whatever. What they found was that in the Hebrew speakers, they didn't think this was a place of a point where you would apologize, because they thought it was a given that you would know that there was some kind of problem. Okay, so they wouldn't walk in the door, all apologies, and they wouldn't go up to their boss afterwards and start apologizing, because they would assume that their boss would know that, of course, they were sorry because they were supposed to be there and they weren't there. So this is an example of socio-pragmatic behavior, okay? So can you see the difference between the two? Does that make sense? Yeah. So that becomes really important for a learner, because it's not just how you do it, it's in terms of the language that you use. It's also, are you doing the right thing at the right time? Okay, and that varies completely across cultures. Okay, stop me if you have any questions. So then I'm just going to give you some basic overall understandings about SLA. We're sort of squishing this up because it's a 5-week course. If it was longer, I would talk about this for longer, but some basic questions, right? Are they universals? What do I mean by a universal? What is a language in general, what's a language universal? Can anyone give me an idea?
It's like the same everywhere, like people apologize in every language.
Good, good. Okay, so that's exactly right. So a linguistic universal means something, a pragmatic or a language universal means something that happens across languages. Like we all do it. It doesn't matter what language we speak, right? So as you can imagine, speech acts are universal in the sense that every culture, every language has a way to apologize. Every language has a way to ask for a favor and so on. But the realization strategies of how you do that across languages we know are completely different. Okay? In one language, if you are asking for a favor, you might have to do a lot of work, you know, before you actually ask for the favor. Oh, I was wondering if it was possible that you may be able to, you know, another language you might not use anything like the same kind of linguistic work. What we know is that for politeness, for things like favors and so on, social power, social distance, and degree of imposition vary between cultures, okay? So something that you might ask somebody who's in a hierarchical, higher power than you in one language may be possible to ask, but in another language you would just never ask that of someone who was in that power position because it's just not appropriate, okay? For example, degree of imposition, you know, in some cultures, we know that you can really ask for a lot. I mean, really a lot. You can ask someone to do something really big. And in other cultures, that's considered to be inappropriate. You know, you can't ask someone a huge favor, right? And we know that there's differences between East and West, for example, in that. Another basic question is, what do learners transfer? Do they transfer pragmalinguistic knowledge or socio-pragmatic knowledge, or both? And the answer is, as you might expect, they transfer both, okay? When they think that an apology is warranted, they, based on their understanding of their own pragmatics, they will apologize. If they don't understand that an apology is warranted based on their own understanding of pragmatics in their language, they may not apologize, okay? What we also know when it comes to what they transfer is the individual learner factors are important, okay? And one of the things that's really important is whether you hold a sort of universalist or a relativist perspective. So if you hold more of a universalist perspective, you have in your head a certain idea of how to be polite. Okay, that means, you know, if I'm going to be polite or if I'm going to ask a request or make an apology, there are certain behaviors that I will do, okay? And it doesn't matter whether I'm doing them in Spanish or in English or in Korean or wherever, okay? That's what makes a good apology or a good request, okay? They tend to be less successful. Why would you think that is? Than people that hold a relativist position. What might be a relativist position? If that's a universal position, what might be a relativist position?
So they take into consideration the points that you have to follow, the routine that you have to follow in Spanish and in Korean.
Good. So a relativist perspective means that you think, I'm not thinking about this as a general thing. I'm thinking about this as, how does this work in Spanish? Or how does this work in Korean? Okay? How, in other words, the socio-pragmatics and the pragmalinguistics are relative to the language that's being used. They're not a moral stance. Okay, that's the easiest way to sort of put it. Universalists tend to think, there is one way, if you're going to be morally good or polite or whatever, there's one way to be that thing. Relativist learners say, well, clearly that depends on what language and culture you're working in. And those learners tend to be more successful because they transfer less. They tend to be more interested in what the differences might be. Another basic question is acquisition different for an L2 child or an adult learner? As you might imagine, it is different, and part of it is because children don't understand a lot of pragmatics. Like, you have to be of a certain age before you even understand what sarcasm or irony is. You don't even understand when you're a kid. You don't understand what a lie is when you're a very young child. They don't lie. They have to come to a certain age before they'll start to lie. Also, they don't understand the necessity of pragmatics. Pragmatics is the one thing that children are taught by their parents. Most of language acquisition occurs as through the context, but children are actually told, Lucy, what do you say? Thank you. Thank you, mommy. Or you need to apologize now. You shouldn't have done that. Oh, I'm sorry. So we teach children how to use pragmatics. Adults understand because they already have a pragmatic system that there is a pragmatic system. They might not understand what the differences are between their language and the new language they're learning, but they certainly understand that you need it. Right? So this is where you'll get, for example, lower level learners who don't have the pragma linguistic knowledge that they need to be perfect, but they understand the socio-pragmatic need. So you'll get things like, I very appreciate you doing this for me. I'll pay back you. I have never taken such a good time. It is so glad, good dinner. It is so glad to me. So all the pragma linguistics is wrong, but the social pragmatics need is completely understood by the learner. And in fact, adults also understand that difference, which is why they try and find something to say, even if they're not sure what it is. What the formula is that they're supposed to use, they're not sure if their grammar, they will try and say something because they understand that socio-pragmatically you need to do that. Another standard thing was would be is there a developmental path? And the answer to that is yes and no. Yes, in the sense that we learn routinized utterances or unanalyzed chunks first, even if we're a low-level learner. So we'll learn to say things like, thank you very much. I'm very sorry. I enjoyed this. We'll learn to say like routinized phrases that operate pragmatically. And there's a certain level of grammatical competence that's required, but it appears to be fairly low. For example, if you look back at these examples, I very appreciate, I'll pay back you, or whatever. This is someone who's a beginning learner, but they're still communicating the socio-pragmatics, right? So in other words, there's no exact relationship between the development of your linguistic resources and the development of your socio-pragmatics. And increased linguistic resources do not necessarily correlate with more appropriateness. In other words, you could become an intermediate or an advanced speaker and still sound incredibly rude, okay? Because you still haven't worked out the sociopragmatics, all right? Even though your pragma-linguistic resources have increased, that is not expressing itself in your language. So, for example, and we know that from this idea of grammaticality acceptability judgments and pragmatic appropriate judgments are largely independent. If you test learners, they're independent variables, not dependent. So in other words, the pragmatic appropriateness judgment is not dependent on the grammatical acceptability, okay? They might say something is grammatically acceptable or unacceptable, and then have no idea about whether it's sociopragmatically acceptable or unacceptable. For example, acquisition of modal forms doesn't necessarily correlate with correct use of modal forms. So modal forms being would, could, can, that doesn't, just because they now know that there's would, could, can, may, doesn't necessarily mean that a learner's going to use it in a socio-pragmatic, correct way. There's also differences as input depending upon whether you're ESL or EFL, and I'm sure that makes sense to you, right? Why would there be differences in input depending upon if you're EFL or ESL? But first of all, what do I mean by EFL and ESL?
EFL is like me. I was born in a country that...
That's you.
Yes, it's me. Yeah. I learned English only in an institution, and outside the only...
As a foreign language, yeah. So you're an English as a foreign language learner. So actually, yeah, everyone that's here that's a learner is an English as a foreign language learner, okay? ESL is English as a second language, which assumes you're learning it inside an English environment, okay? So if you're an immigrant and you come in from Mexico at 7 or 8 or Argentina or somewhere, you start to learn, how old were you, Diego?
I was 8.
I'm like what's the word? Anyway. So, yes, so you are an ESL learner. And of course, that means you've had way more input in terms of sociopragmatic and pragma-linguistic knowledge than someone like Jade would have had, right? And this is partly because of the next factor, which is something we call teacher-induced error, which means that inside a classroom, so IRF is initiation, response, and feedback. So it's a classic teacher-student controlled dialogue. So I say, how do you say, I say, Jade, how do you say that you want a pencil? Jade says, please, could I?
Or can I have a pencil?
Please, can I have a pencil? I say, yes, great. That is an IRF response. Okay, that's a typical, and that's what a lot of classroom dialogue consists of. Okay, so the point is that that's really unproductive when it comes to learning pragmatics, because the context is always the same. I'm the teacher and she's the student, which means I'm the power source and she isn't, which means she's not learning anything about different contextual variables. She doesn't do the same thing with an intimate. You know, if she's married, she does it in Arabic. You know, if she's with her family, if she's talking to her grandmother, she follows the socio-pragmatic, pragma-linguistic rules of Arabic. She never gets a chance to understand what context does to pragmatics, which Diego gets because he's in here, you know, he's got to learn, because he has not only interactions in school, but interactions with people in the store and all these other, you know, the neighbor, you know, do you call him Mr. Pickering or, you know, Uncle Jack or whatever, you know. So he has all the, so teacher-induced error it basically means if you have a very constrained classroom environment with very constrained materials, learners then come out thinking that there's one way to do something, whereas in fact that's not true, because the way that you do something depends on a lot of pragmatic variables, okay, often which are not included in the materials themselves. More often than not, and we can have a look at an example of that. So if they're not included, how do learners learn them?
Excuse me.
Yeah.
So about teacher-induced error, isn't it like something that maybe the teacher doesn't have enough socio-pragmatic or
Absolutely.
pragmatic knowledge? So,
Absolutely. And it could be because a lot of non-native speaker teachers have also had no experience with living in America or living in England, or, you know, so their knowledge of socio-pragmatics is absolutely correct. Yeah. So when I say teacher-induced error, I don't want you to think I'm being mean to teachers. It's not, you know, that's not the thing is that that's just the way it often is in an EFL environment. So it's not that they're deliberately trying to teach the student something wrong, right?
Well, I don't know if I can say something.
Yes, Attilio.
Yes, excuse me.
Totally took me by surprise for a second. I was like,
Excuse
the
me.
voice of God.
No, I'm sorry. No,
That's good.
I have to say this because I'm, of course, an English as foreign language learner and speaker. And I grew up in Italy, and we have been, in a certain way, forced to study, you know, through skill buildings, hypothesis, and learn grammar. And we have a lot of teachers, and I have a lot of colleagues who have never been outside of Italy. And they have never had an experience, maybe in England, maybe in the United States, as I had. And the fact that I studied in the United States for 3 years helped me a lot in order to understand a lot of, let's say, technicalities, a lot of techniques. And I've learned a lot, many things. And the problem is that many teachers, I give you my Italian perspective, is that they have no, as you say, when you think about socio-pragmatics or pragmalinguistics or whatever, there's no sense. They don't understand. They don't have an idea. So they keep teaching the things they have learned years ago without any form of updating. And it's very bad because I just give you just one example. So I don't want to interrupt you anymore because I know.
No, this is a good example.
You have no idea of how many problems I had and still have sometimes when I try to write in English or in American English, just simple examples like color. In England, they write it like C-O-L-O-U-R, right? And the United States, or behavior. Think about these words. You have no idea how many teachers from the Italian perspective, they say that every student who writes color as it's written in American English, it's a mistake. It's wrong.
Yes.
Yes. So considering that you are, basically you were born in England, so who better than you can give me this? What do you want me to respond to this?
That's excellent, Attilio. Yeah, in fact, it amuses me greatly that the English are so concerned about this because the world is now being taken over by American materials.
Yeah.
The world used to be, the control of English language teaching used to be in the hands of the British Empire. And all over China and Japan and everything was all British materials. And some of you who are older, like me, you would have learned these British materials. Now what's happening, interestingly, is the American ESL and EFL materials are taking over the world. They're now in China, it's mostly American materials now, and I don't know about Japan, I'm not sure. Korea, I'm not sure either, but I think it's mostly American now. Yeah, so the world is changing, and perhaps now we're all gonna not use a U instead. Amanda K.
Oh, I was just gonna say Japan as well, because I was in a Japanese immersion school growing up because we were stationed in Okinawa, Japan. And they used, well, we used Japanese curriculum to learn Japanese, but they used American English to teach the off-base students.
Right. Did you hear that, Attilio? So in Japan, they were using the American. So I think it's sort of, yeah, one of those other things that has absolutely nothing to do with language and everything to do with socio-political, and socio-economic issues. So I have to tell you, I've been in America now for 20-something years, so I don't bother putting a U in anything anymore. But the last book I edited, we edited a book for Palgrave Macmillan that came out last year. And we actually made an agreement with Palgrave Macmillan that because we had some authors from America and some authors from what used to be the British Empire, so Hong Kong, that they could be allowed to use whatever spelling they felt comfortable with. And Palgrave Macmillan agreed to that. So in the copy editing, you will see inside the book that in some chapters there's a U for behavior and color and similar words, and in some chapters, and theater is like ER instead of RE, and in some chapters that's not the case because we come from America. So it's a good example. Yeah, and it continues.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, good. Oh, so okay. So another basic question is, do you have to sound like a native speaker? Are native speaker norms the appropriate target? Or can L2 users have a different but acceptable alternative? And that's interesting. It's kind of the most similar thing is like swearing, right? So using bad language in a second language. Some native speakers, if you use swear words or profanities, will say, you, second language speaker, sound really weird using a profanity in my language, right? It doesn't sound right, okay? Because you don't know exactly when to use it necessarily, and you're not using it exactly right. So rather than make you sound like a native speaker, it in fact emphasizes that you're a non-native speaker, right? So there are some similarities in terms of the use of pragmalinguistics and socio-pragmatic things in non-native speakers. So, for example, if a non-native speaker says to a native speaker, "May God increase your bounty," right? This is something that's often used not just for non-native speakers, but also for Indian English or African English speakers, right? They especially from certain parts of West Africa and South India. And native speakers, we would never say that. Like an American would never say that, probably. Certainly a British person would never say that. But we completely accept it on the basis that we know what you mean. You mean, thank you very much, have a great life. And it expresses who you are in your culture, right? So this is also the case with some non-native speakers. They understand that no American necessarily would say, "May God increase your bounty." They understand that that's an expression from their own culture, but they're happy to be identified as their own culture, okay? So you can be bilingual without insisting that you're always bicultural, okay? So you can be a very effective and perfectly happy bilingual speaker, but still use cultural touchstones from your own language. And we know that native speakers don't have a problem with that, okay? I mean, they do if it seems to break some kind of socio-pragmatic boundary. The only example I had was an international teaching assistant, I think from Saudi Arabia, but I can't remember now, who said to a student when they were meeting together to go over some homework, it was chemistry, you have beautiful eyes, and eyes are the window of the soul, right? Now, he didn't mean let's go on a date. But that's what she thought he meant. So she was really super uncomfortable and upset and was like, this older man is coming on to me and making me feel uncomfortable. And, you know, and that, I knew this guy, I worked with this guy forever. I knew that's not what he was trying to, in fact, make her feel more comfortable rather, and in fact made her feel less comfortable. So obviously there's a line here between, you know, what is acceptable and what isn't, but certainly you don't have to sound like a native speaker. That's clear, right? To be intelligible and to be, you know, accepted. All right, so the last one of these major questions before we move on to speech acts is, does instruction help? And the answer is, you'll be happy to know, as we're all teachers, most of us, yes, it does. And the most helpful seems to be explicit instruction rather than implicit instruction. So what do I mean by that?
Explicit is like you directly teach them, like this is the way you apologize or you make a request. But implicit is like they infer from like I don't know, examples or like
practice. So good. So that's exactly right, Jade. So explicit means you say, here's how you apologize. Here are some of the contextual variables that are important when you're learning to apologize. Here's some of the things you've got to think about, right, when you apologize. Implicit means that you might practice it. You might do a teaching activity like we're actually going to do in a second. We're going to do a teaching activity in which you practice it, but you don't necessarily discuss it, right? The noticing hypothesis by Schmidt, and this is the same Schmidt that was back here with Casper and Schmidt. He just died, actually. This year. Said that in order for input to come intake, do you know the terms input and intake? Some of you maybe, some of you not. So in second language acquisition, which you will do with me further down the line, it's one of my favorite courses to teach. Input is everything that goes in, right? A lot goes in. Not a lot stays in, is what we know. In fact, it's always unclear what stays in, right? I'm always astonished by when I was teaching English for a long time, I was always astonished by what my learners actually learned and what they didn't learn, because it often had very little to do with my lesson plan goals, right? So in order for input to become intake, meaning it stays in, and it becomes usable inside your interlanguage, it becomes part of your transitional grammar. He says you have to notice, calls it the noticing hypothesis. You have to be able to recognize that there's a certain concurrence of certain forms in certain contexts, and you have to be willing to look at those forms and look at those contexts. I should have taken this out because I've got nothing on diary entries of US learners in Indonesia, so forget that. But let's talk about Japanese, for example. In Japanese, you have a whole language of honorifics. Amanda Kay, you can tell us about this, right? So did you learn the difference between regular and honorifics?
I learned, yes, and also 3 different alphabets.
Right, but so if we think about the pragmatics, you're thinking about like, if you have to use honorifics in certain situations, right? So you will use a different pronoun or a different verb form in talking, if you were talking to someone who's higher status than you versus, right? So there's one thing about knowing, so it's like for Spanish, it would be like usted and tú, right? That's the very simple example, but in Japanese, it's quite complicated. So you have to first recognize that it depends on the context who you're talking to, and then you have to be willing to use it. Now there was a study in Japan. If anybody's interested, I can find it, where they basically said women in Japan sociopragmatically typically use a higher pitch. Okay, so there's something about being a chick in Japan that you just use a higher pitch, right? So if you're asking for a request or something like that, and this is well known, it's a pragmalinguistic norm. It's not a complicated thing. But when they explained this to some American learners of Japanese, they said, yeah, we're really not interested in doing that, because I don't want to sound like I refuse to be discriminated against. So the women learners were like, yeah, I get it, but I ain't doing it, right? Because it makes me feel like, I'm being discriminated against in some way. So this was so forget the diary entries, that's the example that we'll give you. This is a good example of something like a universalist versus relativist perspective. A relativist perspective would say, okay, I'm not less of a person because I'm doing this in a different pitch. It doesn't mean that in Japanese when I speak Japanese. It might mean that if I speak English American, but it doesn't mean that in Japanese. So, but a more universalist perspective would say, I don't really care what it means in Japanese. I'm not going to do this. Okay, and the study found that the female learners of Japanese didn't want to do this. All right, so that's some basic questions and issues before we start talking about specific areas of pragmatics. So does anyone have any questions or comments about those issues? That's sort of just an overview of what's happening in pragmatics and second language learning in general.
Can you give me a definition of the honorifics again? Sorry, note it.
Well, so the honorific, my Japanese is non-existent, but honorifics are basically, you can actually use completely different verb forms and pronoun forms, depending if you're talking to your boss or talking to someone else.
And there is a suffix system. For example, a tart of summer.
Yes, thank you. That.
Naming. Yeah.
Yeah. So you'd be rude if you didn't use, whereas in English, for example, you just say Dr. Otato, right? The difference is between calling him Sal or calling him Dr. Otato. In Japanese, it has to be the right suffix that goes with the authority, the appropriate authority figure. Thank you.
I kind of wonder if even the word pronunciation, because you bring up gender, like if that can vary depending on genders. Because I think of some instances where when I had like a male teacher, if they said something simple like thank you, it was just like arigato gozaimasu. But then if it was like a female teacher, I would notice they would say arigato gozaimashite. And I never knew like why they ended like the word differently.
That sounds like it's got thesis written all over it, Amanda. Unfortunately, my knowledge of Japanese is, as I say, non-existent.
But what you're saying about women and like the pitch thing,
yes.
I've never heard that before.
Yeah.
So that makes me wonder if maybe that's what it was. And maybe to me it sounded different and to them it didn't.
Yeah. It may well be. I think we've got at least one person that's out there now. Mary Chris is out there now. Sorry, Mary Chris, out there if I've got that wrong, but maybe they can shed some light in the virtual office on that for us, because I just don't know. All I know is that there are differences that are quite considerable in the pragmalinguistic system that we don't have in English. Yeah, so it can cause a real problem. Yeah. Mm-hmm.